And the House is uncharted territory, that is, as it searches for a speaker. We're joined with this hour by Steven Webster, assistant professor of political science at Indiana University, Bloomington. Professor Webster, first of all, certainly a landmark development in Washington. Were you surprised by the outcome of the vote?
I don't think this was something that was terribly surprising. I think if you look back to the beginning of Kevin McCarthy's speakership, you'll recall that it took him 15 tries to actually become elected speaker. And so from the very beginning, he was on shaky foundation at best. The reality is that in order to become Speaker of the House, he had to make lots of concessions to some of the most conservative members of the Republican caucus. The most important of these concessions was the number of members that were required to bring what we call a motion to vacate to the floor. Kevin McCarthy actually made an agreement that only one person was necessary to bring such a motion to the floor. This is precisely what happened today. So I think as uncharted as this is not something that was unforeseeable. I think the writing was on the wall from the very beginning here for Kevin McCarthy.
The move, Professor, being described as a major escalation in tensions within the Republican Party. How is the GOP going to deal with this divisiveness, and how deep are the fissures here?
So that's the million-dollar question. Lots of people are wanting to know who the next Speaker of the House will be. The reality is that the Republican Party is going to have to come up with a consensus candidate. The Democrats do not appear to be in any mood to help the Republicans elect somebody speaker. And so the Republicans are going to struggle to find somebody that the majority of their party can find acceptable. What we're seeing right now in the Republican Party are some real divisions between some of the most conservative members of the caucus. These are generally the people who are most loyal to Donald Trump. The sort of figurehead here is Matt Gaetz, and this is the congressman who brought this motion to vacate to the floor. And so by and large, it's Matt Gaetz and the 7 members of the Republican caucus that voted to remove Kevin McCarthy from his position that are going to have lots of leverage here over who the next speaker is. And the reality is that the divisions that we're seeing in the Republican Party are in many ways bringing the functioning of the American government to somewhat of a standstill.
Indeed, the country now faces uncertainty, Professor. What will be the implications for the potential government shutdown that was narrowly averted, and also other major policy decisions like the U.S. support for Ukraine?
Yeah, not much is going to happen in the House of Representatives until we have a newly elected speaker. So right now, the House is operating under what is essentially a caretaker speaker. This is Representative Patrick McHenry from North Carolina. Now, unlike a traditional Speaker of the House, Patrick McHenry does not have a lot of procedural power. So he can bring the House into session and dismiss it, and he can also receive nominations for a new candidate for Speaker of the House. But until a new speaker is named, nothing can be done legislatively. And so whether we're talking about ensuring American support for Ukraine, or we're talking about the potential for another government shutdown in November, none of those things can even begin to be addressed until a new speaker is named. And so the longer this political process plays out, the longer not only the United States, but the rest of the world is going to be sort of waiting on the edge of their seat here.
Former House Speaker Newt Gingrich has called on House Republicans to get rid of Gaetz, calling him anti-Republican, saying he's actively trying to destroy the conservative movement. What do you think is next for Gaetz? Could he be expelled?
I think it's unlikely that Matt Gaetz will be expelled from the House of Representatives. I think this is not likely to earn him any friends in Washington, D.C. But in many ways, this plays to the politics that Matt Gaetz is so good at. Matt Gaetz is largely successful as a politician because he campaigns against being a Washington insider or against being a, quote, politician as normal or as usual. So this is, what we would expect from Matt Gaetz. This is his political style. So I don't think it's going to really change anyone's opinions of Matt Gaetz. He is quite a polarizing figure, even within the Republican caucus, which is something that we're seeing play out today. I think what's really interesting here is the political dynamic, because we're entering into a presidential election season, and voters are going to be looking at these dynamics and trying to figure out how these things align with a potential Trump renomination for the presidency, what it means for Joe Biden's renomination, what it means for a potential impeachment of Joe Biden. And so the backdrop here is, as it usually is, the presidential election coming up in 2024.
So where do Democrats go from here? How can they sort of capitalize on this?
Democrats can really sort of chart their own path here. One would not expect them to help Republicans elect a Speaker of the House. I think the only way that this is possible is if they were able to extract any number of policy concessions from a potential future Speaker. Part of Matt Gaetz's initial frustrations here is that he believed that Kevin McCarthy had cut some backroom deals with Democrats to ensure American funding for Ukraine. And so I think given that, it's hard to imagine any potential Republican speaker wanting to be seen cutting deals with Democrats, because in today's Washington political sphere, we just don't see much bipartisan cooperation. And so I think Democrats are going to be content to vote no against whoever Republicans put forward, and they're going to force Republicans to come up with a candidate amongst themselves.
All right. Thanks very much, Professor, for breaking that down for us this morning. Steven Webster, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Indiana University, Bloomington.